We're going to do a little tomato troubleshooting today here on the Beyond the Garden Basics podcast. By the way, today's podcast and newsletter is an exclusive for paid subscribers to Beyond the Garden Basics. Now, I know that some of you are listening to the podcast on some other service for free, such as Apple or Spotify. But if you were a paid subscriber, you would be getting more information in the newsletter about tomato troubleshooting, including a transcript that's been manually corrected with additional information. Sorry, Apple. By becoming a paid subscriber, you also get access to the vast library of previous newsletter and podcasts here at Beyond the Garden Basics. Paid subscribers also get priority access on getting garden questions answered and the ability to add comments. And again, paid subscribers also get an exclusive newsletter and podcast each Monday. Free subscribers won't be seeing it for several weeks. And I thank you, by the way, for your paid support. So let's get started with some tomato troubleshooting with my guest from Redwood Barn Nursery in Davis, California, Mr. Tomato Head himself, Don Shore. Tomatoes, tomato plant problems. Oh, there's always problems every year. And with the changing in the weather, if you live in an area where summers are getting hotter and hotter, well, tomato problems are changing a little bit, but some good old problems remain. And who better to talk about the ongoing battle against tomato pests and diseases and environmental concerns than with Don Shore, owns the Redwood Barn Nursery in Davis, California. Don, every year we start getting the tomato questions about this time. It seems almost that the first malady that comes up with people's questions is, what is this leathery spot at the bottom of my tomato?
Yes, the blossom end rot question. Hello, Fred.
Hi.
First of all, let's be optimistic. We're in an area where it's really easy to grow tomatoes in general. And most of California, we have a climate that allows us to grow them without using a whole lot of pesticides and other remedies. But you're referencing BER, blossom end rot, which shows up almost always on some of the very first tomatoes that set, the ones that people get so excited about. They set early, they planted early, they want to beat the season, they get some fruit set on there, and then they look on the bottom. And if it's still green, they sometimes notice a little discoloration or a little oddity to the bottom or the blossom end of the fruit. As it ripens, that part is soft and mushy and unpalatable. Yes, you can eat the rest of the fruit, but it's very disappointing when that happens with the very first fruit that's set. Notice it's usually on the first fruit that's set. And we know now about blossom end rot that it is primarily a disorder related to low temperatures during the fruit expansion phase and sometimes keeping the soil too wet when the nights are cold.
Ah, yes. And of course, people will rush to the nursery and look for your shelf of calcium sprays because they keep hearing that blossom end rot is due to a calcium shortage when it really is just an inability of the plant to uptake that calcium because what's going on in the soil, as you mentioned, with cold, wet soil, it can't uptake calcium. How's that calcium spray shelf doing?
Well, I have it up there for the people who won't listen to me. And we not only get requests for calcium spray, we get requests for gypsum, which is a calcium product. We also get requests recently for some reason for superphosphate, rock phosphate, potassium products, and of course the inevitable Epsom salts as somehow going to solve this problem because they're focusing on some kind of cation, some kind of fertilizer remedy for what is actually a physiological disorder of the plant. So the bad news is you don't have an on-the-shelf product that's going to solve it. The good news is, as the soil warms up and the plant grows and you water deeply and evenly, the next fruit will be fine. One thing many gardeners have observed is that some varieties are way more susceptible to blossom end rot than others. Roma, which is a very popular home garden tomato variety, the first fruit almost always get blossom end rot. Just plan on it. And actually, you can see that discoloration even before the fruit ripens. If you see that, my suggestion is just pick those off, dispose of them. The next ones that come along will be fine. So this is a problem that the plant basically outgrows.
Yeah, blossom end rot, for the most part, is operator error. And it could be a number of things like you mentioned, uneven watering. Too much nitrogen fertilizer can also lead to that as well. Or if your soil pH is wrong, I think tomatoes prefer a soil pH usually in the range of 6 to 6.8 or so?
Yeah, and most of us on our side of the valley are dealing with even higher pH issues, and so that might be a factor. Ammonium-based fertilizers are definitely correlated with it. So if you're using ammonium sulfate, that could be a factor. Again, the most common correlation I've observed is people planting early. And they may not be listening to this podcast, which tells them to plant on April 27th.
Well, that's here.
Maybe
yes.
plant here in this area, waiting until the soil temperature is about 60 degrees, or nighttime temperatures are about 55 degrees. You can plant earlier, and the plants will grow fine if the temperatures don't fluctuate too wildly, but that early fruit will be affected. And so one of the most common things I find when I ask people, when did you plant, is that these are the folks who planted in March, early April in this area. The plants are growing fine, but that first fruit may just have to be sacrificed. Good news, we got a very long growing season, plenty of time for good fruit to develop.
Yeah, exactly. Have you asked the question when people are complaining about blossom end rot if they are growing in raised beds? Because sometimes if you plant in too sandy of a soil, that can lead to blossom end rot.
I'm sure that's a factor. And we have more and more people doing that. And honestly, managing the soil and the soil moisture especially, and in fact, the nitrogen in raised beds is more complicated than just out in the open garden soil. So that becomes an added factor as well. So blossom end rot becomes one of those things that we just have to move through. And I watch the weather, and I've noticed a strong correlation of blossom end rot about 8 weeks after we have a unusually cool period of night temperatures. My only suggestion would be to gardeners to water more carefully, water deeply, thoroughly, and then have intervals between watering so you're not keeping it constantly soggy. That really is the key anyway to successful tomato growing, but it really seems to be a very important factor in blossom end rot.
And I think a lot of these purchased alleged cures for blossom end rot puts in the gardener's mind that they work, when in reality what they're doing, they're now paying more attention to their plants. And they may spray on a calcium spray that basically just rolls off the plant, doesn't do any good. Right. But they are watching their watering more, and they're being more careful.
They're watering more attentively, which is really what we're trying to get at. Also, the placebo effect is a real phenomenon in horticulture.
Yeah, right. It is.
I did this. It worked. Therefore, I'm going to do it again next year.
Yeah, we usually do more combination attempted cures than just one, and then we go back and think, oh, well, that one thing worked. Maybe, maybe not.
The Tums tablet underneath the plant when it was planted, right?
Oh, don't even say that.
Let's back up. We don't recommend Tums for planting tomato plants. And Epsom salts don't do anything for blossom end rot.
One nice thing about using mulch around tomato plants is that can help moderate blossom end rot, because what mulch does, it helps to moderate soil temperature and moisture fluctuations.
Yeah, we want to keep the soil moisture even and not keep the roots saturated and not let them go too dry. Seems to just be a stress reaction more than anything.
I am seeing more pictures of people's tomato gardens on social media, and they're using plastic mulch around their tomatoes. And there have been studies in the past that show certain colors of plastic mulch, like red, can increase early tomato production. But I'm wondering what plastic mulch might be doing to the soil temperatures.
I would think it would be increasing them in some cases, and I think it would also make it more difficult for you to water correctly. So I would urge people not to jump too quickly into things like that. The common mulch with compost, some sort of good organic material, is always beneficial, especially in a raised planter where you're having difficulty maintaining even soil moisture and maintaining a good steady supply of nutrients. The mulch you choose, if you buy a good quality product in a bag, probably has some nutrients in it, probably has some source of nitrogen, as well as just enhancing the soil moisture and its ability to retain moisture and retain nutrients. So mulch is good. My preference is natural mulch, something you actually buy that's a good quality compost product.
All right, let's talk about sun issues. Here in California, because of our increased temperatures in the summertime, longer bouts of heat, we're seeing more and more plant failure by July, early August, where some varieties that have been very popular here, like Juliet, all of a sudden are croaking in midsummer. And I'm wondering what sort of strategies people can employ to mitigate that if they live in an area where the weather is getting too hot too soon for too long.
Well, I just had a conversation with someone who was talking about how great his tomatoes did last summer, and then they all kind of fizzled out in August. They shouldn't do that. They should continue to grow all the way till Thanksgiving, practically here in the Sacramento Valley and many parts of California. Invariably, I then ask, how are you watering? And what they've done is they have set up a watering system early in the season, which was appropriate to the young seedlings and even to the young growing plant, but does not provide sufficient depth of watering to a more mature plant. Tomato roots grow deep. They'll go down as deep as they possibly can. And so my suggestion in general to get your tomato growing, flowering, and fruiting longer is to water more deeply as the season progresses. Less often if you prefer. It depends on what else is in the bed with the tomato plant. Personally, I always have my tomatoes separate from almost all the other vegetables, and because they need less frequent watering, but longer watering as the season goes along. And that way, if your plant is growing well and you're watering deeply, it can hold the blossoms, it can hold the fruit, and you can be harvesting all the way through October and even into November here in the Sacramento Valley and many parts of California and other climates that are similar to ours. My biggest harvest invariably in my garden is in the month of October, when the fruit that's set in August are ripening. And I have a lot of people coming into my shop in August whose plants are sort of fizzling out at that point. Invariably, they're running their drip systems for 10 or 15 minutes, perhaps every day, perhaps every couple of days, and that's nowhere near long enough. I think you have a good example of how long you run your drip systems on your raised beds. If I recall, it's a little longer than 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah, it's more like 2 or 3 hours, twice, maybe 3 times a week, depends on the heat. And the whole idea is to get that water down as deep as possible to encourage the roots to go deeper. If you're just watering a drip system 10, 15 minutes, you're putting on a quarter of a gallon of water.
No, that's enough for the young seedling when it first goes in and for the first few weeks, but it's best to just water longer. Unfortunately, raised beds, once again, have the drawback of draining out more quickly. So you definitely have to water more often in a raised planter. Those who are just doing it out in a normal garden bed may be able to go 5, 6, 7 days between waterings as long as they run the system for a couple of hours. The main thing is a tomato plant needs several gallons a week. And if you don't give it that, the plant will keep flowering, keep trying to fruit, and then, just kind of fizzle out as we get into the month of August. We can continue to harvest well into the early fall here, as long as the plant roots get deep enough and they get the moisture that they need.
You're making all those people listening in Michigan very, very jealous.
This is tomato country out here. All those tomatoes you buy in cans in the winter, a lot of them came from California.
Exactly.
The other thing that happens in the summer heat, though, and this happened a lot in the summer of 2020, we had 7 heat waves in the Sacramento Valley. The fruit burned. It's scalded on the west or the southwest side of the fruit as it was ripening. And that was a real problem. We, of course, if we're going to have hotter summers and hotter episodes of high temperature during each summer, that can be a real risk on the fruit as it ripens. So sun scald is something, especially people growing peppers, bell peppers have commented on this, but it also happens on tomatoes if the fruit itself is directly exposed to the sun at 5 or 6 in the afternoon when we're 105, 110 degrees. That fruit can be damaged to the point that you can't really use it. So that has been an issue, and I expect we can anticipate it'll be an increasing issue.
I was just watching a squirrel steal something from my yard and move on. I think he took a donut peach. All right.
It's very nice of you to share your wildlife, share your garden with the wildlife.
Yes, I know. All right. Sun scald usually manifests itself as a light brown or leathery look on the side that's exposed to the sun. I think one problem that people are doing that is encouraging sun scald is they're pruning the leaves away for whatever reason.
Yeah, keep that canopy as dense as you can. I will say that certain varieties are more susceptible to it. I've never personally been a big fan, for example, of Celebrity, which is a very high-yielding tomato, but it has a pretty thin canopy of foliage. And we get a lot of sun scald on the fruit on Celebrity. Look at your spot where you're planting them. That would be one possibility. If you're having a chronic problem with sunburn on your fruit, maybe do find a place that's a little shaded in the afternoon. My concern is people are coming in looking for shade cloth to put over their vegetable gardens, 55% shade cloth over their tomato plants for the growing season. I can almost guarantee that will reduce your yield. So what you don't want to shade the plant. Summer vegetables are full sun loving plants. What you want to do is shade that fruit as it's beginning to ripen if a heat wave is in the forecast. So some people will just put a couple stakes in the ground to the west of the vine and be prepared to just put some shade cloth over that if we have a heat wave. But here's another suggestion. If you have fruit on the vine that is at breaker stage, getting into some fruit physiology jargon here, in other words, gone from solid green to just lightening up a little bit, or even a little bit of that yellow or red color, it'll ripen on your counter. Very high temperatures slow down the ripening of the fruit on the vine. This is a fact. When we're 100 degrees or even 95 degrees plus, ripening slows down outside. On your counter in your kitchen, it will continue. So if there's a heat wave threatening, and we certainly have warning about these, triple digit temperatures, and you've got a bunch of fruit that's just blushed or beginning to turn red, perhaps if those fruit are exposed to the direct western sun, you may wish to pick them, bring them in, set them on your counter, and let them ripen over the next 3 to 5 days indoors. That's a simple way to avoid sun scald on that particular batch of fruit in that particular heat wave.
I would think it would be important, just like you would be harvesting those tomatoes that are slightly yellow or turning towards the end of the season. When you're doing it now, when you put them on your counter, you would want to separate them in space and have air circulation all around them. So possibly set them in a container, maybe bring in one of those garden trays, and that always looks nice on the kitchen counter, and keep your tomatoes in a single layer with a little bit of space between each one so they're not touching.
Yeah, if there were any kind of injury on one of them, such as caused by stink bugs or something like that, it might lead to some rot and decomposition, which can spread pretty quickly to the fruit nearby. In general, when you're storing things like this, not like the peaches, whatever, you bring them into the house, they will continue to ripen on the counter. They shouldn't be in contact with each other. You could get a special tray just for this, just to make it more elegant, put it out on your counter, and those are the tomatoes that are ripening. But most people don't know that the high temperature slows down the ripening process. It actually does. It kind of shuts down the plant when it's extremely high temperature. So if you're wanting that tomato for a salad 3 days from now and it's 100 degrees, it'll actually get there faster on your counter than it will on the vine.
Okay. 2 other sun-related issues you may be seeing on your tomatoes if you live in a high heat area: solar yellowing and tomato fruit cracking. And both of those basically are cosmetic. Again, use that kitchen knife and cut away the discolored portions.
Well, they're also varietal. A lot of the heirloom types are known for cracking or splitting, and it's just one of the things that goes along with growing those particular types. That's why they're not commercial varieties, because they don't hold well or store well. They're fine. There's certain varieties I grow every year. Amos coli, which is a great sauce tomato. I know it's going to crack along the stem end. It just happens, and you just cut that out when you use it. And that's one of the reasons, if you're into storage or you want your tomatoes to look picture perfect, just one of many reasons for focusing perhaps on having at least some hybrids in your portfolio.
I like what you said in a previous episode of Garden Basics about choosing heirloom tomatoes, and that was to choose heirlooms that were developed in your area. And we talk about Brandywine only producing 1 tomato here, whereas if you're growing tomatoes back in Pennsylvania, where the Brandywine came from, you'll have a bush full of tomatoes.
Presumably, yeah. I assume there's a reason they grow in Brandywine, Pennsylvania. My experience here is you get 1 to 2 very large, extremely delicious fruit off of a 10 to 12 foot vine, which is not exactly the yield I'm expecting. Most of the heirloom varieties are from the East Coast of the United States. Well, not the East Coast, but upper Midwest, Mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, places like that. Beefsteak, Brandywine are 2 that I very routinely talk people out of at my garden center because they simply don't yield well here. We don't have very many heirloom tomatoes in California because California is too young to have developed any varieties that have been around that long. We do have, of course, varieties from Italy and places like that are very well adapted to our climate here because it's a very similar hot summer, low humidity climate. And try the heirlooms, that's fine. But I'm very nervous when people come up to the counter with 6 tomatoes and all of them are heirloom varieties. I say, could you at least throw in a cherry tomato in there, or an early girl or a champion or something, so that I know you'll get some good yield? Because in 2020, as an example, very hot summer, heirlooms in general did not perform well. A lot of tomatoes, even hybrids, didn't perform well, but they were particularly just slow at producing and didn't do very well. So try to balance your heirlooms for their flavor with your hybrids, which also have very good flavor, for their reliable yield and their disease resistance. That's another big advantage of hybrid tomatoes.
Like they say at the stock market, past performance is no indicator of future results. Let's talk about what worked last year in our gardens here. Here in California, again, heat was a big issue. And surprisingly, one of the best performing tomatoes in my yard was the orange oxheart, which is an heirloom. And I think the reason for that, it was getting late afternoon shade.
Yeah, your local microclimate makes a huge difference. And last summer, 2020, Early Girl was a top performer for me all season. And my general expectation is it's going to be more of an early producer and a late producer. I happened to plant it where it got shade after about 3 p.m. And I think that was a big factor just because of the number of heat waves we had in the summer of 2020. So it's not a bad idea if you're a longtime tomato gardener to keep notes and see what the consistent patterns are. No variety performs perfectly every year, but there's some varieties that perform poorly in general, year after year. I've mentioned a couple of them, Brandywine, Beefsteak, and others. And I try new varieties every year, and I've come up with some that are very consistent. So I do have a list on my business website of my picks of the top 5 or 6. But I also try new ones. There's a whole new series of Wild Boar Farms tomatoes doing very well here in the valley, here in the Sacramento Valley. But I think your listeners back east might want to try them, see if they do well in Brandywine, Pennsylvania, or places like that. These are developed by a farmer in California, so they may become our equivalent of heirloom varieties. He's a farmer. He wanted yield and he wanted flavor as well. So he's looking for ones that are good performers. You just got to try different things every year. You got to plant 20 or 30 tomato varieties. That's all there is to it, Fred.
By the way, Harvest Day returns to the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center on Saturday, August 1st from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. I still think this is the best garden event in Northern California. It's filled with practical advice on the best gardening techniques for backyard gardeners in the Fair Oaks Hort Center's 1-acre demonstration garden. The event features educational talks by some of the most knowledgeable horticultural professionals in all of Northern California. There's smaller talks, too, little 20-minute demonstrations on practical skills such as summer fruit tree pruning, herb gardening, and composting. You'll get expert advice from friendly master gardeners who walk and talk with you, answer your questions. That's something I do there. And there are vendor and community booths, including local garden-related clubs, local and state garden-related agencies, vendors, and food trucks set up on the grounds. And by the way, this event is free. Free to attend with free parking. It typically attracts large crowds, so arriving early to beat the summer heat is recommended. Again, it's Harvest Day at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center. It's Saturday, August 1st, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. Free admission, plenty of free parking at the Fair Oaks Park in Sacramento County. We'll have a link to Harvest Day in today's newsletter, or you can just do a search for the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center, and information about Harvest Day will just be a click away. The tomato hornworm, or tobacco hornworm, depending upon the number of stripes on its back, I think it's what it is a very common occurrence, and it's not something to be fearful of. And
well, people are. It's interesting how people react when they see a 4-inch caterpillar with a horn on the back. Some of them kind of jump up and scream. You need an amazing amount of foliage in a very short period of time. So it can do a lot of leaf damage, and it might even eat some fruit and wander off onto a nearby pepper or eggplant by accident, but it mostly just eats foliage. And usually there's only 1 or 2 on the vine when you're dealing with them. So it's just a matter of first finding the droppings, looking straight up on the vine from where the droppings are, finding this thing looking at you and dispatching it by whatever method you prefer. Personally, I like to just kind of throw it about 20 feet and figure that takes care of the problem. Others like to snip them in half with their pruners, which is pretty gross, but it works. It turns into an amazing, beautiful, fascinating moth. So if there's a kid in the household and you've got something to put it in and you've got enough tomato foliage, at least once you should probably put this thing in a giant jar, feed it a bunch of leaves every day until it finally pupates, and then let it turn into the amazing sphinx moth that it becomes. But really all they're doing is eating foliage. They're not a huge problem on the plant except for the amount of foliage any caterpillar has to eat in a given day. So you can generally find them. If you don't want to pick it by hand, you can go get a BT spray, Bacillus thuringiensis, organic spray, very specific for caterpillars, doesn't harm beneficials or anything like that. And go ahead and spray the plant. The caterpillar feeds on it, and it will be killed by that. So there is a spray option, but you're spraying a whole vine for 1 or 2 caterpillars. Probably easier just to get some sharp-eyed helper to go out there and find the caterpillars and dispatch them directly.
I'll trade you tomato hornworms. I'll take your leaf-eating tomato hornworms for my fruit-eating tomato hornworms.
Well, they do that. And there's also the tomato fruit worm,
right,
which is much more annoying because it burrows right into the fruit. And obviously that fruit is no longer useful. They're also harder to control. So there unfortunately, you find the hole tunneled into the side of the green fruit. Just pick it off and dispose of it and keep an eye out. That's a case where the BT spray could be very helpful. If you're having an ongoing problem with tomato fruit worm, different insect, different caterpillar, you might want to spray for that. And again, this is an organic, very safe spray.
And don't forget, Mother Nature's trying to help you out here. The social wasps, paper wasps, and others will bite chunks out of the tomato hornworm and take it back to the nest. And also, if you attract birds to your yard, they'll go after those critters as well.
Yeah, mockingbirds and blue jays can be big helpers in the garden. They eat all kinds of bugs, and they'll go after caterpillars. They'll go after leaf-footed bugs and stink bugs, and they can actually give a surprising level of control on all of those problems.
I've noticed, too, that I think there is some sort of Darwinian change going around in the bird world because the robins that are hanging out here around my blueberry bushes don't fly away when I come out now. They just stand their ground and give me the stink eye.
Yeah, those are their blueberries, not your blueberries.
Exactly.
You're sharing your space with them. It's not really your property.
All right. Now, there are ongoing issues with tomatoes that can be weather-related, like late blight, black mold, bacterial speck. Not much you can do about the weather.
Well, those are all diseases, and they're on the plant. I hate to say this, probably when you got it. That's the simple thing. The simplest preventive on this is to inspect plants at the time you either buy them or accept them from your friend or get them at the, from that guy down the street who's selling them for 50 cents. Look at the leaves, look for spots on the leaves. I'm not real deeply concerned in our arid climate about early blight or bacterial speck. You can simply pick those leaves off and dispose of them. As we get into periods of 10, 20% humidity, which is pretty much every day here in the summer, those will go away. Late blight can be problematic, especially for listeners in rainy summer climates. It can be horrific. It can really spread rapidly. So carefully inspect the plants when you buy them. Look for those spots on the leaves. And I strongly suggest you go online and look for illustrations of late blight versus early blight and bacterial speck. Cornell, Rutgers universities have some great illustrations you can find online. Late blight can spread rapidly into the vein of the leaf, into the petiole of the leaf, and all the way into the main stem. And it causes a dieback that is reminiscent of fire blight on apples. I mean, you get a sudden dieback of leaves or even whole shoots on the plant. In our climate, it rarely progresses much past a few leaves and maybe a side branch. I highly recommend you prune it out at that point, put that pruning into a bag, dispose of it. Generally, the problem goes away because it doesn't rain here in the summer. If we had overhead watering or rain and very high humidity, it could spread very rapidly. And this has happened in the mid-Atlantic and upper Midwest, parts of the country where they've had years where late blight is a problem in the supply chain, he says subtly,
yes,
in the supply chain. And people took home plants that had late blight on them, and then they had a rainy June or even into July, and it spreads very rapidly down the whole bed of plants. In that situation, you're going to need a fungicide. You're going to probably need to go talk to your local garden center. They may recommend you rotate a couple of different fungicides because these can be very problematic. In our area, if you prune it out, and here's the other key thing, spread your plants far enough apart, 3, 4, 5 feet apart. My tomatoes are 6 feet apart.
Oof.
So that there's good air movement, good sunlight on them. Prune out the affected portion. That's usually the end of it for us. And that would probably help a lot in those areas where late blight can be very problematic. Air movement and sunlight are the enemies of disease.
Oh, but let's blame the gardener for letting their sprinklers hit the tomatoes as well.
Well, yeah, that can be a factor. Yeah, you shouldn't be sprinkler irrigating tomatoes in general.
Yeah.
I mean, I wash off tomato plants for other reasons, but I do it on a day that I know the humidity is going to drop down, as it does here, to let's say 10 to 20% in the middle of the afternoon. So if you're in an area that's muggy, you don't want to be overhead watering at all.
Right.
And rinsing plants off can make it splash from plant to plant very rapidly. Space them out. Get your plants more spaced out.
Yeah, and if you are hand watering your tomato plants, you may want to do it lower to the ground instead of spraying over the top of their heads. Although if you live in a non-humid area, you might be able to get away with that if you water early in the day to allow the plant to dry off. But if you water late, you're going to have things like late blight, black mold, bacterial speck. At farmerfred.com, as well as at the Farmer Fred Rant blog page, you can find a whole list of these tomato troubleshooters that we are talking about, along with the symptoms that you will see like on the leaves we've been talking about as far as with the blights or bacterial speck. With bacterial speck, the leaf spots are near the edge of the leaf. They're dark brown with a yellow ring. With late blight,
halo, yes.
The halo effect, right. The late blight, a beautiful purple brown area on the leaves. I mean, it's just a beautiful shade of purple, but that's a sign of late blight.
And it can move very rapidly. That's the other thing about that one. It can move rapidly and cause a lot of dieback. I know that commercially, they frequently spray with copper as a preventative early in the season. There are organic versions of copper spray that you can find if that's your preference. That's a preventative, and if you've had a problem with it in the past, it might be worth considering. In arid climates, it's not generally an issue. So
you used a word a few minutes ago that we should reemphasize. You used the word rotate, and I think it's very important not to plant your tomato plants in the same spot year after year, especially if you've had problems with root knot nematodes or fusarium wilt or verticillium wilt.
Yeah, those are the big three right there. There's soil-borne problems. The nematodes are not, disease. The other two are diseases. And the general recommendation is not just tomatoes to rotate, but anything that's related to tomatoes. So that includes potatoes, peppers, eggplant, tomatillos, Aunt Molly's ground cherry. All of those things that are in the nightshade family should be rotated out of a bed. Now, this is challenging for a lot of people. You don't have a lot of space in your backyard. If you're at the stage of planting a yard, I would suggest having 3 beds for vegetables. That makes it easy. So one of them is for the nightshade family members, and then you just rotate to the next one, to the next one. It's standard in farming to rotate tomatoes with beans and corn, things like that. Just putting in something that's not a host for those diseases and those pests. And that's the reason for that is because those problems, when you get them, are very difficult to manage. Managing a problem in the soil that has built up to the numbers that are doing injury, like the root knot nematode, very, very challenging. Yes, there's a product on the market. It's called Nematode Control. It's a drench. It's not cheap. So probably better to prevent the problem if you can possibly do it just by how you rotate your crops.
Exactly. Not all nematodes are bad. You can find beneficial nematodes that can control the root knot nematodes.
Yeah. Yep, and there's this soil drench that's derived from a saponin-based material. It's an organic material, but read the label. It's actually got a warning label. So it'd be better if you can just prevent the problem from the start by where you plant and how as I say, most people's backyards, they have one garden bed for the vegetables, and it's not the easiest thing to remember. So look for that VFN label on the hybrid tomato varieties. And the heirlooms don't have this. The VFN stands for verticillium, fusarium, and nematode resistance. And that's something that's been bred into many of the hybrid tomatoes. I should also mention, we were talking about late blight. There are new varieties that are resistant to late blight. So if you're in an area where late blight is a problem, as you're looking through the seed catalog, that's a common comment. Now, that's a complicated subject, to put it mildly, but it would be another tool in your tool chest in terms of dealing with these problems in a region where that can be an issue.
Another great reason to plant hybrid tomatoes, look for those letters VFN, and let's not forget TNA.
Right.
That would be tobacco, mosaic virus, and alternaria. There are other problems that might be attacking your tomatoes this summer that you may see on your other plants too, like whiteflies, aphids, powdery mildew. And, a lot of this has to do with people loving their tomato plants and other plants to death with too much nitrogen fertilizer. That stresses the plant. It puts out weak growth that's very attractive to those pests I just mentioned.
Yeah, lush growth certainly encourages whiteflies. I'll tell you, though, whiteflies are pretty easy to manage for me. I've found that the spacing, the wider spacing, so I don't get this big overgrown mass of tomato foliage, has made a big difference. This is an interesting one. Dragonflies love to eat whiteflies.
Okay.
They're entomophagous. That's today's vocabulary word, entomophagous. They eat other insects. And they can do a very good job of keeping whiteflies under control. In my own garden center, whiteflies are managed by very vigorous rinsing of the plants early in the day, 3 to 5 days in a row, stressing the undersides of the leaves where the larvae need to be blasted off the leaf. And we find that we get very good control that way. We do it early in the day so the foliage has a chance to dry off by the end of the day. And if we had a problem that was continuing beyond that, we would probably move up to neem oil very carefully, not using it on a hot day, or even a light summer oil. But we've generally not had to do that as long as we monitor carefully. We monitor plants, not just the tomato plants, but plants nearby that are nesting sites and resting sites for whiteflies. And we vigorously rinse those as well. you will find over time, if you garden in the same place and you keep planting flowering things amongst your tomatoes and herb plants nearby, and you have some ornamental grasses over there on the other side of the garden, and you have some shrubs that have flowers at different times, beneficial insect populations will increase steadily and consistently. And over time, you'll get to the point where you see aphids, you see whiteflies, and they kind of magically go away. And that's because you've encouraged the beneficial insects to feed on them. But in order to do that, your garden has to be something more than a desert for them. It has to have places for them to hide and multiply and increase. And you have to reduce your use of insecticides. And it's also rather important in the case of some, like the dragonflies, to have a water source nearby. So something that can, all this diversity in your garden is, it's fundamental to getting the populations of beneficials, not just the insects that come in and help control, but birds, mockingbirds, blue jays, things that come in and eat the bigger bugs. Generally speaking, once you have a really active garden that way, your pest problems will diminish. They'll probably take care of themselves. Whenever I see someone bring in a sample of aphids to my garden center, I'll take them out and I'll show them, look, some of these are already parasitized. You can tell they're bloated, they're tan, they're not moving. So your problem is solving itself. Rather than buying a pesticide, now let's let nature run its course.
Many farmers here in California are now lining their crops with alyssum because that attracts a whole host of beneficial insects that do just exactly what you're describing. We'll have a link on today's show notes about plants that attract beneficial insects because those can take your insecticide spray bills down to nothing if you attract enough.
Personally, I have actually never sprayed a tomato plant with a pesticide here.
Never?
There are people listening.
Never?
Never. There are people listening who cannot get through a season, rainier climates in particular, without spraying because their crops would be ruined. So we're in an area where we can get to the point where it's not necessary at all. I've never had to spray a tomato plant with a pesticide in Sacramento Valley.
He said, bragging. Okay, fine.
I think we're just lucky, honestly.
Yeah, all right. Now, there is one other thing that may cause people worry, and when they start seeing oily brown leaves, especially near the base of the tomato plant, that's usually a sign of tomato russet mites.
Yeah, every summer it seems like I get one or two customers that have that. I had it happen on my vines one time, way back when I first was gardening here. And they sort of dry up from the ground up. It's really hard to tell because it takes a 40-power hand lens to see this particular type of mite. And they're tough to control, by the way. It happened to my crop one year, and it's never happened since. And this is, that's the way it seems to work. It is a mite. It's a very tiny one, and it comes from the ground level, and it moves up the plant, gradually increasing. And by about the 1st of August, your plant can be about half dead from this. It's a tough one to control. Vigorous rinsing with water probably helps to some degree. Mites in general are very challenging to control. You generally look for a suffocating agent like a thin oil or something like that. But I've got to always mention when I say anything about an oil, high temperatures can cause leaf burn when you spray an oil. So you've got to, if you've got a period of cooler weather, that might be a fine time to go out and spray. But in our normal, the average summer temperature of 93 degrees here in July and August, that's our average high temperature in this area, that'll burn plants. So you've got to spray when we're in our cooler spells of that average. And it can be a challenging one. One main thing on the russet mite is at the end of the season, everything needs to go away. All of the foliage, all of the plant, all of that needs to be taken away, not to your compost pile. In this particular instance, I would send it out to the landfill.
Yeah, exactly. Clean up at the end of every season and also during the season, too. When you see fallen fruit, fallen leaves, rake them up, put them in the green waste. Don't try composting them. There are a couple of other cosmetic tomato problems, such as cat facing or maybe the concentric circles you see near the stem. I wouldn't worry about those.
Those are usually watering related. A plant was just inadequately watered in a period of increasing temperature. Again, if you can get to the point where you're deep irrigating and your soil retains moisture, those of you with raised planters need to work to get the soil to retain moisture. There's a bunch of things you can do. But when you do water deep enough, a tomato plant needs several gallons of water when you irrigate it. And you'll find that if your soil holds moisture pretty well, you tend to have less of a problem with that. But again, those are things that can just be cut out and the rest of the fruit is usable.
Is there anything we left out?
Stink bugs.
Okay.
And leaf-footed bugs. And those guys show up and they're scary looking, particularly the leaf-footed bug, which is an increasing pest in many parts of California. I don't know how widespread it is in other parts of the country. And it pokes its little proboscis into the fruit. It makes a little spot that you would only notice if you were looking for it. So in general, they don't do a lot of damage to fruit. They do this to peaches as well, any kind of soft fruit. They're a general feeder. Usually, people find some here, some there. It's not a huge problem. Sometimes they go out and they'll find 50 on one fruit, which is really gross. And in that case, you have an opportunity to go get a bucket, put some soapy water in it, shake them into the bucket, problem solved.
Yeah, leaf-footed bugs, it turns out, are rather popular throughout the Sun Belt. There's even a Florida leaf-footed bug.
Charming.
Yes, they have their own name.
We have 3 or 4 species in California, and they're very recognizable. But the only issue is that we find them in all different stages. We find the nymphs, we find the adults, and the nymphs look rather different from the adults. And they do, like all other stink bugs, 2 aspects. 1, they stink when you squish them. 2, they are a congregating type of insect, which means you tend to find them in groups, particularly on your pomegranate tree. They really like pomegranates. So if you're looking for the source of them on your tomatoes, look at your nearby pomegranate. The developing fruit, you may find 30 or 40 on a single fruit. And they don't really do much damage to the pomegranate. They do a little bit. You can go after them with a handheld vacuum cleaner or just tap them off into a bucket full of soapy water.
There you go. I was just looking here about how widespread the leaf-footed bug is. It really does love the Sun Belt and even slightly cooler places. The leaf-footed bug has been reported as far north as Long Island, New York, and ranges south to Florida, west to Iowa and Kansas, southwest through Texas to California, including Lower California, and into Mexico, Guatemala, and Costa Rica.
And it is definitely an increasing pest in many parts of California, and I think that may be related to the cropping patterns in ag in our area. It's a pest of almonds. We've had tens of thousands of acres of almond trees planted over the last 30 years here in the Sacramento Valley. And guess what? I have to identify leaf-footed bugs several times a week, whereas 20 years ago, it might be 3 or 4 times during the course of the whole summer. They are a stink bug, and there are other stink bugs that are problematic in other areas, and one that's new to our area. And generally speaking, those poke their proboscis into things and cause a little discolored area on the fruit. From a home garden standpoint, they're not a huge problem typically. Obviously, farmers can't have those kind of cosmetic problems on their fruit.
Now, what is it Mother Nature used to say? Oh, yeah, Mother Nature abhors a monoculture.
I think the nature abhors a vacuum is the phrase you're looking for.
Well,
but a vacuum can be a very handy tool in this case.
Yes. Now, remember, if you're using a vacuum to pick up stink bugs, that vacuum's going to stink, so leave it outside.
Put it in a plastic bag when you're done with it to make sure they don't just crawl right back out of the vacuum, too.
Don Shore, Redwood Barn Nursery, Davis, California. Thanks for troubleshooting our tomatoes for us.
Great to be here. Thanks, Fred.